Imagine living your whole life believing in one truth, only to discover it's been a lie. A twisted experiment. A hidden network controlling everything. This is the shocking true crime story that rocked America, and you won't believe the dark secrets we're about to uncover. Stay with us till the end, because the truth will leave you speechless. The air was thick with tension. The sky darkened, casting a shadow over the small town. It felt as if the whole world had gone quiet. But then, a scream shattered the silence. The sound echoed through the narrow streets, bouncing off houses, reaching the ears of anyone who dared to listen. It came from the old Miller house, the one at the end of Maple Street, where no one ever went, the one that everyone whispered about. For years, rumors had circulated. A family tragedy, a mysterious disappearance. But no one knew for sure. That night, everything changed. Detectives arrived in a blur of flashing lights. Their footsteps were heavy on the cracked sidewalk as they approached the house. Inside, it was chaos. A young woman, her face pale and soaked with sweat, sat trembling in the corner. Her eyes were wide with terror. The room smelled of old wood, dust, and something darker. The officers moved cautiously, scanning the room for clues. On the floor, they found blood. But not just any blood. It was fresh. The woman's breath hitched as she pointed towards the basement door. They could hear something muffled behind it. The detective hesitated before unlocking it. What they found would haunt them forever. In the basement, a small figure huddled in the corner. It was a child, covered in bruises and dirt. Her eyes were hollow, like she'd seen things no one should ever see. The detective reached out, but the child recoiled, shaking her head.
"Please, no," she whispered.
"Don't let them take me." The words sent a chill down his spine. What had happened here? What was this family hiding? The woman's story was hard to believe, yet every word rang with an eerie truth. She spoke of a secret they had all tried to bury. The mother, the father. They weren't who they claimed to be. And what they had done, it would forever change everything. The truth was far darker than anyone could imagine, and it had been hiding in plain sight all along, in the heart of the town, where no one dared to look. Until now. The silence that followed was deafening. Nothing would ever be the same again. The town buzzed with whispers the next day. Everyone was talking, but no one knew the full story. The detectives kept their mouths shut. What they had found was too horrific to share. And yet, the rumors spread like wildfire. People claimed the child was a ghost. Others swore the house was cursed. But the truth was far more chilling. The Miller family had been hiding a dark secret, one that spanned years. The young woman, the one who had been found in the corner of the room, was the last to escape. Her name was Emma. She hadn't been seen in public for over a decade. No one even knew she existed. Her disappearance was never questioned. Until now. Emma's voice was shaky as she spoke. She described how the family had lived in isolation, locked away from the world. They didn't just keep to themselves, they kept something else. Something twisted. The basement was their sanctuary, and it was where the darkest parts of their lives unfolded. The child, her name was Lily, had been kept in the basement for most of her life. Emma said she wasn't the first. There had been others before her. But Lily, she was different. Lily had been born into this nightmare. Her whole life had been spent in the dark. Barely a glimpse of the world outside. Her only company was the cruelty of her parents. Emma's voice broke as she recalled the horrors she had witnessed. The endless cruelty, the punishments, the neglect. But there was one thing Emma hadn't shared. The thing that had driven her to escape. It was a moment. A single, unbearable moment. A night when the silence was pierced by something otherworldly. The house was shaking. The walls seemed to tremble with an unexplainable force. Then there was the sound. A scream. But it wasn't Emma's. It was something deeper. Something darker. The sound came from the very heart of the house. from the depths of the basement. And that was when Emma knew. She had to leave. But she couldn't leave Lily behind. She would risk everything to save her. The truth was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. And it was only the beginning. The next few days were a blur of police reports and interviews. The town was in shock. No one could believe what had happened behind those closed doors. Emma was taken to a safe place, away from the prying eyes of the community. She was too fragile to face anyone just yet. Her mind was still unraveling the horror she had witnessed. Lily, the little girl, was in a hospital now. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her, but she was more than just physically broken. She had lost everything. Her childhood, her innocence, her sense of reality. But as the investigation continued, something didn't sit right with the detectives. They'd seen the evidence. The blood. The bruises. But there was something more. A deeper connection between the family and the horrors they had endured. Emma's story was haunting. She explained how her parents had kept them isolated. But there were also whispers of experiments, of strange rituals carried out in the dead of night. Emma had tried to block it out, but the truth had begun to surface. The house. The basement. It wasn't just a prison. It was a place of experimentation. And the family had been conducting something far worse than anyone could ever comprehend. Emma said her father had been obsessed with science, but not the kind that could help people.
He was fascinated by the human mind.
And his obsession had led him down a dark path. He believed that by pushing the limits of fear, pain, and isolation, he could unlock something extraordinary. But it had all gone terribly wrong. Lily, in particular, had been the subject of his experiments. Emma couldn't save her sister.
Not then.
Not when it was too late. When the truth finally came out, the town was horrified. But what they discovered next was even more unsettling. The Miller family wasn't the only one. There were others. A pattern. A trail of broken lives stretching across the country. A secret network of people with twisted beliefs who thought they could control the human mind. And the Miller family had been just one piece of this terrifying puzzle. The final piece was yet to be uncovered. And the truth? It was far darker than anyone had prepared for. The deeper the investigation went, the more disturbing the revelations became.
It wasn't just the Miller family.
It was a network, a hidden web of dark experiments that had spanned years, even decades. The authorities had stumbled upon a monstrous truth, one that no one could have anticipated. Each time they unearthed a new name, a new family involved, the shock only deepened. And yet, no one had connected the dots until now. There were whispers of more children, more families, victims who had been erased from history, their stories silenced by fear, by shame. As the media began to cover the case, the small town, once peaceful and quiet, was engulfed in chaos. People demanded answers. What had happened to these families? What had driven them to commit such unthinkable acts? But there was one thing no one was prepared for. The day they found the final piece of the puzzle. A journal, buried deep in the Miller family home. Its pages were filled with notes, ramblings, drawings, strange symbols. But among the madness, there was a pattern that matched others they had found. It was clear now that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a planned operation, a carefully orchestrated conspiracy, a plot to control, to manipulate, to break people in the most terrifying way imaginable. Emma's voice trembled as she explained the journal's significance. Her father had been a part of something much bigger, a secret group of people who believed they could create the ultimate human mind. The group, as Emma described, was convinced that by breaking the mind, they could rebuild it stronger, more obedient, more controllable. But the methods they used, torture, isolation, manipulation, had destroyed any possibility of success. Instead, they had created monsters. Emma's father, her mother, and many others involved had been lost to their own obsessions. Their humanity stripped away in the pursuit of something unnatural. And it wasn't just the families that suffered. The children, now adults, had been used as tools in a game they didn't understand. The horror of what had been done to them was something that no one could fathom. As the authorities pieced the story together, they realized something far more chilling.
The group was still out there.
The web of darkness had not been completely unraveled. And if the Miller family had been just a small part of it,
How many more were there?
the truth had shaken the entire country. But the question lingered.
Who was really behind it all? And who would be next?
The darkness wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The search for the truth became an obsession for the investigators. They combed through every lead, every scrap of information, every connection they could find. But the deeper they dug, the more elusive the answers became. Each discovery felt like a breadcrumb leading them into a labyrinth with no exit. They interviewed more survivors, people who had been part of the twisted network but had managed to escape. Each one had a different story, but the horror was always the same. The rituals, the experiments,
The brainwashing.
but what disturbed the authorities the most was the realization that these people weren't acting alone. There were powerful forces behind them, an unseen hand guiding everything. It was a shadowy group, pulling strings from the darkness. They had been around for years, maybe even longer than anyone realized. The group operated in silence, moving like ghosts through society. They didn't just control the people they experimented on. They controlled others, too. Politicians, scientists, influential figures. All linked to the same cause. The same twisted belief that the human mind could be manipulated and reshaped for their own gain. And as the pieces came together, a chilling thought began to surface. Had this been going on for decades? Had anyone ever truly been free of their influence? The more Emma learned, the more she began to question everything she thought she knew. Was her father just one of many? Had the Miller family been targeted because they were easy prey, isolated and vulnerable? Or was there something more to their involvement in the network? She felt a growing sense of dread, knowing that the truth could destroy everything. Her mind raced. She had to find answers. But the closer she got, the more she realized just how dangerous the people behind this really were. One evening, she received a strange message. It was an anonymous tip. The sender claimed to know who was at the top of the pyramid, the one person who had been orchestrating everything. The mastermind behind the experiments, the group, the manipulation. But the message didn't just stop there. It warned her that digging any deeper would lead to consequences. The group didn't want anyone to know the truth. And they would stop at nothing to keep it hidden. Emma knew then that her life, and the lives of others, were in grave danger. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The warning echoed in Emma's mind, haunting her. But the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. She couldn't stop now. Not when the lives of so many innocent people were still at risk. The tip had mentioned a name. A single name, one that would send chills down anyone's spine. Dr. Richard Hale. The name sounded familiar to Emma. She couldn't place it at first, but then it clicked. Dr. Hale had been a prominent figure in the field of neuroscience, a genius, or so the world thought. He had written books, given lectures, even appeared on TV shows discussing the potential of the human mind. But something about him never sat right with Emma. His presence, his influence, had always felt wrong. She knew now that he was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, the puppet master of the entire operation. Emma had to find him. She needed to confront him, to make him pay for what he had done, for what he had created.
But there was no easy way to get to him.
Dr. Hale was a ghost, operating under layers of protection. His influence stretched across powerful circles, money, politics, academia. He had access to people who could erase anyone who got too close. Emma's heart raced as she pieced together the small bits of information she had gathered. She couldn't trust anyone, not even the authorities. She knew they had their hands tied, too, tangled in a web of corruption and fear. But she also knew she couldn't fight this alone. Desperation led her to contact a journalist, a reporter who had been covering the story from the beginning. Someone who had no fear of exposing the truth. The reporter's name was Sarah. She was relentless, sharp, and had a reputation for uncovering the darkest secrets. Emma confided in her, explaining everything about the network, Dr. Hale, and the warnings she'd received. Sarah was hesitant at first, but after seeing the evidence and hearing Emma's story, she agreed to help. Together, they began to dig deeper into Dr. Hale's past, tracking his movements, his connections, and his influence. The more they uncovered, the darker it became. Dr. Hale wasn't just a neuroscientist. He was a manipulator, a man who had used his intelligence and charm to climb the ladder of power. And he had done it at the cost of countless lives. The truth was uglier than they could have ever imagined. But now they were getting closer. And with each step, Emma felt a growing sense of dread. Because she knew that confronting Dr. Hale meant stepping into the heart of the storm. And the storm was closing in on them. The closer Emma and Sarah got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Every step forward felt like they were walking a tightrope over a vast, unseen abyss. They had started to piece together Dr. Hale's twisted history, but the more they discovered, the more it became clear. This man was untouchable. His power, his reach, he had so many layers of protection that getting to him felt impossible. But Emma couldn't stop. The weight of the truth was too much to bear, and she couldn't let it destroy any more lives. Late one night, after hours of digging through public records, Sarah made a breakthrough. She had tracked down an old colleague of Dr. Hale's, someone who had worked closely with him years ago. The person had vanished, disappeared without a trace. But Sarah found an old address, a lead. They decided to take the risk. As they drove through the deserted streets, Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The road ahead seemed darker, more foreboding, as if the very air was warning them to turn back. They pulled up in front of an abandoned building. The windows were boarded up, and the door was rusted shut. It was as though the place had been forgotten, left to rot in silence. But Emma knew better. This was where it had all started. They broke in, moving cautiously through the dark corridors. The building had once been a research facility, Dr. Hale's old laboratory. It was here, in the shadows, where he had conducted his experiments, twisting the minds of his victims in ways no one could comprehend. In the back, they found an old storage room, filled with crates and files. Emma's hand trembled as she flipped through the papers, Sarah's flashlight illuminating the dark, yellowed pages. The files were a nightmare. They contained names, dates, locations. And there, at the top of the list, was something Emma hadn't expected to find, her own name. She froze, staring at the paper, disbelief washing over her. Her father had been involved with Dr. Hale. Not just involved, he had been one of his collaborators. The realization hit her like a wave. Her whole life, everything she thought she knew, had been a lie. Her father had been part of the very thing she had been trying to escape from. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. But before Emma could process it any further, a noise echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. Heavy. Steady. Someone was coming. They quickly gathered the files, stuffing them into bags. But the footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, the door to the room creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a figure Emma never thought she'd see again. Dr. Hale. A twisted smile stretched across his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low, calm, as if he had been expecting them all along. The air turned cold. And Emma knew, in that moment, they were trapped. This was the end. Or so it seemed. The chill in the air was suffocating. Emma's pulse raced, her mind scrambling for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. Dr. Hale's presence seemed to fill the room, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he had been preparing for this moment all along. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing ominously. "Did you really think you could stop this?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. Emma's breath hitched in her chest. "We've been watching you," he continued, his gaze never leaving her. "You and your little reporter friend. You think you can expose me? Bring me down?"
It's too late for that.
Sarah stepped closer to Emma, her hands trembling, but she stood her ground. "We have the evidence," Sarah said, her voice shaky but defiant. "People will know the truth. You won't get away with this." Dr. Hale's lips curled into a twisted grin. "You really don't understand, do you?" he whispered, taking another step forward. "You never had a chance. None of you do." A shiver ran down Emma's spine. Her father's involvement, the experiments, the endless manipulation, it all made sense now. Dr. Hale had orchestrated everything. He was the mastermind behind it all. And what was worse, he had been grooming Emma for this moment from the very beginning. "You were never meant to escape," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You were just another piece in the puzzle, Emma. But you were too weak to see it."
Too naive.
Emma's stomach churned. All the pieces were falling into place, and yet she couldn't grasp the full extent of the horror. What had Dr. Hale done to her father? What had he done to her? Dr. Hale laughed softly, as if reading her thoughts. "Your father was a valuable asset. He understood the power of the mind, how it could be shaped, controlled. But he wasn't strong enough. Not like me." He paused, his smile widening. "Your whole life has been a lie, Emma. The experiments, the isolation, it was all part of a plan. To create the perfect subjects, to break them and rebuild them into something better." A sickening realization hit Emma like a tidal wave. Her father hadn't just been manipulated, he had been complicit. He had chosen to be part of Dr. Hale's sick vision. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to show weakness. "I won't let you win," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with defiance. Dr. Hale's expression darkened. "You already have," he replied, his tone cold and final. Before Emma could react, there was a sudden movement behind them. A loud crash. The sound of footsteps, running. A distraction. The door slammed open with a force that sent Dr. Hale stumbling backward. A group of police officers, armed and ready, burst into the room. Emma's heart leaped with hope, but Dr. Hale wasn't done yet. He reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and metallic. A trigger. And in that instant, Emma realized he had a plan B. "You should have stayed away," Dr. Hale muttered, his finger hovering over the button. But before he could press it, a gunshot rang out. Dr. Hale's eyes widened as he collapsed to the floor, the device slipping from his hand. The officers moved in swiftly, securing the area. Emma stood frozen, the weight of everything finally crashing down on her. It was over.
Or so it seemed.
As Dr. Hale was dragged away, a horrifying thought crept into Emma's mind. Had they truly stopped him? Or had they just stumbled into an even greater nightmare? The rush of adrenaline that had carried Emma through the past few moments suddenly gave way to a creeping sense of dread. Dr. Hale was down, but something in Emma's gut told her the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The officers cuffed him and dragged him out of the room, but the darkness still lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. Emma turned to Sarah, her heart racing. "Is it really over?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know. It feels like we've only uncovered the tip of the iceberg." Emma's mind raced. The journal, the files, the experiments, all the pieces of the puzzle had finally come together. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Dr. Hale couldn't have been working alone. There had to be others. Others who were still out there. The police cleared the building, taking the evidence and securing the area. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they had only just begun to scrape the surface of something far more sinister. As the hours passed, Emma found herself staring at the files they had uncovered. The names, the dates, the patterns. It all pointed to something bigger. Something that spanned decades. Dr. Hale wasn't just a scientist obsessed with control. He was part of a network. A network that had been operating in the shadows for far longer than anyone realized. And as Emma sifted through the documents, one name kept repeating. A name that sent a chill through her veins. A name she recognized. Her own. Emma's heart raced. It wasn't just her father who had been involved in these experiments. It was her. Her entire life had been manipulated, twisted, in ways she hadn't even begun to understand. Her father's betrayal, Dr. Hale's sick obsession, it was all part of something far larger. Something insidious. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of lies and manipulation. She had spent so long running, trying to escape the horrors of her past, but the truth had found her. And now it was too late to turn back. She turned to Sarah, her voice barely a whisper. We need to find out who's really behind all of this. It's not just Dr. Hale. Sarah nodded, her face pale. I know, but we need to be careful. If Dr. Hale had this much power, imagine what else is out there. Emma's mind whirled as she thought about the countless lives that had been destroyed, the families torn apart by this cruel network. And as she looked at the files again, she realized with a jolt, there were still so many names missing. Dr. Hale was just the beginning. There were others out there, still operating in the dark, still pulling the strings. And Emma wasn't done.
Not yet.
Because the real truth? It was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The nightmare was far from over. The weight of the truth hung over Emma like a storm cloud, suffocating and relentless. The world she thought she knew had shattered into a million pieces, each one revealing a darkness she couldn't have imagined. But she couldn't stop now. Not when she knew there were others out there, hidden in the shadows, continuing the work Dr. Hale had started. She couldn't let this evil continue unchecked. Sarah stayed by her side, though even she could see the toll this was taking on Emma. Every new piece of information was another wound, another layer of betrayal. But Emma wasn't backing down. They both knew that the fight wasn't over. The files they had uncovered, the names they'd found, those were just breadcrumbs. They were clues, leading them toward something much larger. As they sat in the quiet of the room, sifting through the evidence, a knock at the door startled them both. It was a detective, a young man with weary eyes. He handed Emma an envelope, and she could feel the weight of it in her hands, like it carried the weight of the world. Inside the envelope was a letter, written in a familiar hand. It was from Dr. Hale. I knew you'd find the truth, Emma, the letter began. But what you don't know is that you've already become part of it. The plan. It's been in motion long before you even realized. The experiment isn't over. It's just begun. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. The nightmare had been much worse than she thought. They hadn't stopped Dr. Hale. They had only opened the door to something far darker, far more powerful. The network was vast. And it had never been just about the experiments. It was about control over everything. Over people, over the system, over the future. Find the others, the letter concluded. They're out there. And they're waiting for you. Emma's hands shook as she put the letter down. Her heart raced. She didn't know who was more dangerous, the people who had controlled her life or the ones still hiding in the shadows, waiting to strike. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. Not ever again. The fight for the truth, for justice, had only just begun. And Emma was ready to finish it. Days turned into weeks, and Emma could feel the weight of everything she had uncovered slowly consuming her. She had gone through every lead, every document, every whisper in the dark, but the pieces never quite fit into place. The deeper she dug, the more she realized the nightmare wasn't just about stopping Dr. Hale or exposing the experiments. It was about confronting a force that had been manipulating everything for years, controlling lives in ways unimaginable, and rewriting the course of history from behind the scenes. But after all the terror, after the revelations and the countless sleepless nights, Emma knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let this evil thrive. She couldn't let it consume more innocent lives. She had to be the one to stop it. One last confrontation. One last push to expose everything. Emma, with Sarah by her side, made the decision to go public. They had the truth. They had the evidence, the documents, the names. Everything was in their hands, ready to be laid bare for the world to see. With one final call to the authorities and trusted media outlets, Emma watched as the story broke, driving through every channel, every screen, every home in the country. The world was about to know what had happened, what had been done in the shadows. The investigation took on a life of its own. The media frenzy exploded as the full extent of the conspiracy came to light. Dr. Hale's network was exposed, his influence crumbling as the truth spread like wildfire. As the dust settled, Emma realized that although the battle had been won, the scars would never fade. The truth had come at a heavy cost. Her father was gone, lost to the darkness. The pain of betrayal would always remain. But in the end, justice had been served. The evil had been exposed. The innocent victims had been given a voice. And Emma, despite the pain and the heartache, could finally look at herself in the mirror and know she had done the right thing. She had ended it. The truth had set them all free.
And that was enough.